I'm going to make you a co-host too, just to be safe.
Okay, yeah, thanks, since I gave away all my power.
Yes, I know. Okay.
There we go. So take it away, Andre. Thank you for being here.
Absolutely. So hi, everyone. My name is Andre Hennig. As mentioned, my background is industrial and organizational psychology. I've been practicing in the field for almost 10 years now, which seems a little crazy to me. And I am here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, but got my grad degree at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. And so just a tiny bit of history on me. When I was in college, I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do. I found my way to some psych courses and then found an intro to psych class, which really got me interested. But what really brought it to life for me was through my job, where I went through a couple transitions with leaders and really got to understand how awesome a great leader can be. And then on the flip side, how challenging a leader can be when they are not, in my opinion, as good as they could be. And so it really got me thinking about the practical application of industrial and organizational psychology and gave me a real life example. And at that moment, I kind of decided that that would be something really cool to do, is to help others become good leaders and then be a good leader myself to kind of drive that. And so that has kind of been in the background for me as I got into my IO career. As I mentioned, I got my master's. I graduated back in 2012. For me personally, I always knew I wanted to get a master's. I know we'll talk a little bit about the difference between master's and PhD, but I knew that that research component wasn't as strong of an interest as mine, as going applied. So I knew early on that I wanted to kind of come in, get my education, get my degree, and then work applied. And so my first role out of college or out of grad school was as a program manager at US Stratcom, United States Strategic Command in Omaha at Offutt Air Force Base. This was a really interesting job and one that I actually started as an intern. The former intern was another cohort of mine at UNO, and as she was leaving, I applied for the job and got it. It was not something that was directly IO related, but our skills, especially around data analysis, really lent itself to the role. And so it was an amazing learning experience for me, honestly, because I stepped into a world that I really didn't know and got to get up to speed as well as start to sharpen my skills in my first role out of grad school. A lot of what we did in the assessments division was looking at the effectiveness of our military operations. So started with understanding what that operation was, defining the goals, the objectives, and the outcomes, and then finding ways to assess against that in an objective way. So that was really the piece that the IO degree really helped me with, is understanding how we can gather that data, how we can try and assess against these military objectives and goals to bring something to life in terms of an after action report on how that military operation went. While I was in this role, though, I knew that I wanted to transition into more of an IO role. So that's when I was able to transition to a consultant role at Target. So working internally at the Target corporate headquarters in Minneapolis, Minnesota. This was really something that I had my eye on for a while, was the idea of being an internal consultant. And so what that means briefly is, because Target is such a big company and because they have so many different business units, while our team was an internal team, we acted as almost a consultancy to the rest of the business. So we would oftentimes work on broad enterprise practices, defining how we build assessments for pre-hire, how we roll them out, how we use those, as well as then working on smaller specialized assessments within very small divisions. So working with just finance, or working with our stores organization, or working with somewhere in distribution. Because Target was so big and had all of those business functions, that's kind of where that internal consultant idea comes from. In this role, I was also able to work on our survey and engagement team. So working on Target's annual employee engagement survey, as we look to understand how our employees are feeling. What is their kind of satisfaction with their current job, with the company, with the strategic direction. And so what we would do is send out a survey annually and then analyze it from a lot of different perspectives, starting from an overall level and then breaking it down by business unit, breaking it down by leader. And then we would present our insights to the strategic business leaders. So as an example, I had our chief finance officer as one of my internal clients, and we would go and deliver a presentation on here's what's working really well in your organization based on what your employees told us. Here's maybe where some areas where we can look to improve, and start a conversation around how can we drive improvement to make sure that our employees are feeling and behaving and acting the way that we want them to, so that they can be engaged and be invested in Target. As well as I was working at Target, I was able to get involved in our diversity and inclusion team, which is something that came about because I was interested and really got to reach out and offer my support, again, from that kind of more science perspective from an IO degree of how can we be as objective as possible and how can we drive the right decisions to support Target from a D&I perspective. During my time at Target, I had a great experience. As I got towards the end of my 4.5-year career there, I wanted to see challenge myself with something new. And so that's why I was interested in external consulting. And so I transitioned into a role at SHL, which is where I still currently am. And just to give a little bit of context, when we talk about external consulting, that's again where it's an external firm that then does consulting work with different companies that hire them out. Vice, a Target, where I was an internal consultant, where again, that company is so big that we have that internal consultancy. At SHL, we work with different clients to really help build, design, develop, and deliver solutions so that they can better understand talent to drive hiring decisions around and promotion and succession management and other talent management decisions and people decisions. It's really trying to understand what data we can gather, how we can get as much data as we can to really drive those talent management decisions, and partnering with our internal partners who hire us to really understand and try and come up with what's the best way that we can deliver on what you need. And so when I was at Target, I would often work with external consultants, and now that I'm at SHL, I often work with internal consultants. And so it's just a different kind of lens of where you can take that IO degree with still that consultancy mindset. When you're external, it is more of project-based work. So I will often have multiple projects with multiple different clients at the same time, and they're usually shorter duration. When I was at Target and with many other internal consultants, it's often a few bigger projects that are more long-term, and you're working on that project from idea generation and initiation all the way through the end as you're rolling it out and you're implementing and deploying it. Those are the pieces towards the end of the deployment where often as an external consultant, I'm not as involved in as we turn it over to that internal project team to drive. And then lastly, I recently got a promotion into the managing consulting role here at SHL. And so what I'm doing now is taking a step back from my delivery work while still working with some clients to focus a lot of my time on leading a team. And so that is something that kind of fulfills a lot of what I initially got into my role to do, to not only help drive the work of my team, but I'm also working with a lot of leaders externally. That's been something I've been able to do in my entire career here at SHL, working from the assessment perspective, so understanding what key senior leaders might have the capabilities we're looking for in a role, as well as developmentally. So taking them through assessments to really understand where their capabilities lie and where some gaps are to help drive development. And that's one of the pieces that I enjoy most of my role, is being able to work with those leaders one-on-one and see them take in that kind of objective assessment data, but then turn that into a so what, turn that into a how do we focus on development? How do we help you become the best leader that you can be? So that is a snapshot of my career so far. Ronnie, is there anything else you wanted me to get into from a master's kind of versus PhD perspective?
No, there are a bunch of questions, so I think we'll let Lindsay talk about her career, and then we'll pose those questions that are in the Q&A to the both of you.
Perfect.
So take it away, Lindsay.
All right, I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes.
All right. So I also attended the University of Nebraska at Omaha and worked under Ronnie. My career takes a little bit of a different trajectory than Andre's. So When I was working at Central States Health and Life Company of Omaha, that actually started as part of an internship and practicum experience while being at University of Nebraska. So part of our program, and this might come up in the Q&A, included things with practical experiences as part of our required degree progression. So I went the master's and PhD route for a couple of reasons, but so my career trajectory started with those early practicum experiences. So I can talk a little bit about why I chose the PhD route. For me, it was a very interpersonal choice, I would say. Once I knew that there was a degree for IO psychology and that you could get a PhD, I wanted to go all the way. So do it all. And I think that's one of those things when you're thinking about the difference between the two, that internal motivation to finish a PhD often needs to be greater than whatever your external motivation might be in terms of career path, because it is such an intense course, preparation for that. So my career trajectory has taken a little bit of a different route because of that. But I chose that choice because there was more to do, there was more to learn. I didn't want to think I hadn't learned all the things I could learn. But you need to kind of want it and love it to be able to do that. And research does become a huge part of that. Because of my research background and having that, at the time, I wasn't quite finished with my PhD. I was all but dissertation. I left Omaha to go to Microsoft for a personal reason. I got married and my husband was in the Navy and he was transferred out to Seattle. And so I quickly networked into a group there at the time, which was called the People Research Team. And this was a team of IO psychologists, mostly, other PhDs, and also some qualitative researchers on our team. So to me, this was a dream job. It was one of those things that when people would ask me, what are you going to do when you get out of school? Where can people work with this degree? My example had ironically always been big companies like Microsoft was my answer. And so when I had the chance to move to Seattle and start networking with organizations there, it was kind of a dream goal job. And I got to learn very quickly from very experienced professionals with IO degrees, as well as some qualitative experience. So I joined a team that was responsible for employee surveys, research, analytics. Before we even called it people analytics at the time, we just called it research. And we were a lot of times the research and development group for the HR organization. So people called us the behind the curtain team, the geek team, anything like that, because we weren't really client facing. We didn't do a lot with leaders in the organization. We worked a lot with HR teams and our HR leadership to design programs, to design competency models, 360s. Sometimes that would actually spur an entirely new team to be created during this phase that I was there. So we created an entire assessments team based on the work that our team started and sort of handed off to that whole team to grow and manage. So that was a really intense experience, but also very great from the experience to learn from other IO psychology professionals in a giant, fast company. From there, I went to Starbucks, where I worked in a similar team, but at that time started managing more full-time employees. At Microsoft, I started there actually as a contractor, sort of an intern, moved to full-time. And then when I went to Starbucks, I also started managing kind of larger teams. So this space in Starbucks, we actually started to work more with our leadership population. So like Andre mentioned, kind of he had a client group of the CFO. We would have larger engagements and projects that we would work on with other similar teams. So we would work with the organizational development team and the HR business partners when there was a project or something that a specific group would need. Sometimes it was interventions as a result of the employee survey, and that's where I would come into play. And sometimes it was putting together things like we had an entire several day combination of assessment center and business meeting for our regional store leadership employees. And so as part of that, we would design part of that assessment day and their experience for that, and we would contribute to that. So there was a little bit more in front of the curtain when I went to Starbucks than when I was at Microsoft. From Starbucks, similar in time frame, I left Starbucks to do an external consulting role at a group called Paris Phoenix Group, which was run by my former leader at Microsoft. So she had left to do some external consulting and recruited me to join her. At the same time, I said yes to teaching an adjunct course in survey research consulting at Seattle Pacific University. So I was able to very much change the career trajectory kind of with two choices at the same time. I took on the teaching role as well as the external consulting role at the same time. My external consulting role, because we were very small, very independent, I would say there was probably at times a max of 5 of us in that company. We did kind of different probably than where Andre's coming from at SHO, which is a much more established consulting firm. We did everything from sales and trying to find projects and clients and kind of sell and scope and write up proposals and meet with clients and do the actual work. Anything from project management to assessment design, all the way through to the end of the engagement. So we didn't have a lot of support staff, if you will, and projects weren't assigned. We had to go kind of, hunt for our own work. Within this kind of time frame, I'll say from a life perspective, there was a lot of feast or famine because we were working on our own in such a small team. But there was also, what I loved was a ton of variety. So it really opened up my ability and my team's ability to be able to work on lots of different kinds of IO work, sometimes at the same time, sometimes at different times. But we weren't kind of attached to one way or one method or one product, if you will. We really came at it from a custom perspective. And then when we would need to bring in other external consulting firms or say, what you really need is an assessment, or you need something that is, commercially available from some of these larger companies, we could then help them decide who to partner with or go with for some of those bigger, maybe long-term types of investments. So I did that for quite a while, for 8 years. And one of the things that Andre said kind of spoke to me in terms of, he said, they're kind of pulling out at the time they get to an implementation phase or, something wraps up with an external consultant. And that's true. And I really missed that part of it from not being internal. And so I missed what I would say kind of the last chapter of the story, or the what happened. So I really wanted to seek out an internal role after that, to be able to see projects end to end, and year over year over year, to see that continuous improvement and really learning from what we had done. When I was external, we didn't always have that. We might get brought in by the same client again, but we might have missed, several months worth of things that had happened or changed, or they ended up doing something a little bit different and we didn't know quite what had happened. So I missed that kind of last chapter. So I went to Expedia Group to start a global talent management team. So for this, also became another broad role with leadership and leading a team and growing a team, really. We had very little in this spaces. So starting and consolidating things that had been done perhaps in pockets of the company, but not for the company overall. So Expedia Group owns Hotels.com, Hotwire, HomeAway, Vrbo, Orbit, Cheap Tickets, Travelocity, and some other commercial business travel brands. And each one of those companies was doing a lot of things very differently. So it wasn't allowing the CEO and our leaders to really see what kinds of people work here. What do they want out of their employee experience? Can we do things at a global and company-wide level that will make a bigger impact than if we do some of these smaller projects? So that was my challenge for many years. was to create and kind of grow up some of the things that had been started and really bring a science perspective. So what was different in Expedia Group was I was the only IO psychologist in my team, whereas prior to that, in all my previous roles, I had people on my team reporting to me, or peers, or my manager had been in IO psychology roles. In Expedia, I was, one of only a few. The other couple I can think of were in HR business partner roles at that time. So really bringing a lens of science and research to the work that we were doing, sometimes working with external partners and consulting firms, sometimes working with, with kind of what I'd been able to create on my own. And in one case, bringing in Ronnie and an academic perspective to our leadership development program and bringing in some of her creativity research. So Expedia had quite an openness to science and testing and learning, and really bringing in some evidence into what we were doing. And so I did that for 5 years, leading and growing that team. And then in 2020, I decided to take a step back. I was going to take a sabbatical, which would be kind of a extended period of time off for those who might not be familiar with that term. And I was going to actually travel and use some of my travel points from all those years working for a travel company. And that sabbatical the travel didn't happen in 2020, as it didn't for many people. And so instead, what I ended up doing was starting a freelance consulting firm on my own, as well as contributing to a book on employee experience and using some of the principles around design thinking and agile working that we had been using at Expedia, and applying those in the HR space. So 2020 was a bit of a different year. So I was able to consult, to contribute to a book, to do some things I hadn't planned on, but were really, really a good way to slow down, but also think about what did I want out of my next role. And I did want to go internal again. So now I am week 2 at Allstate, and I am there in a new role in a new team, Director of Culture and Employee Experience. And so for me, this is a kind of a good full circle for me of what I love about IO psychology and bringing research to helping an organization. So to me, it is using the research we know about organizational culture and change and behavior change, and bringing that into an organization who is really shifting how they work together, how they do business, how they make money, and all of those implications for employees, and 40,000 employees changing the way they work, not just because of pandemic and being at home or the virtual side of that, but really leaning into different ways that business is going to last. And so I am now the leader of a dedicated team to lead our organizational culture change.
Great. Thank you very much. So there are a number of questions in the Q&A. I'm just going to read them and let you guys answer them. Also, Sarah and I have been answering some of the questions more related to admission to graduate school and things like that, typing in our answers. What are some of the biggest challenges you had to overcome with being an IO psychologist?
I can go first. I've had this conversation with some students that I've mentored, and just in conversations, I think I'll maybe approach it from the transition, because I think a lot of what we're going to face in the work is challenges that everyone in the professional environment faces. But one thing that I've seen and I've talked with IO students on is as you get applied, is finding that balance between driving what is best in class from a research and from a education perspective, and to what is actually going to be feasible in the business world. And so I think when you're in grad school, we're learning the best of if we have all the time, all the resources, all the money, we are going to go about each of these processes in a certain way, because we know that that is what's best. When we get into the workforce, I think it's finding a way and finding a balance between feeling comfortable with what we're doing from a science perspective, from our expert perspective, to say that I think this is as good as we can do, knowing we don't have the amount of people to do what I want to do, or knowing we don't have the time to do what I want to do from a research and development perspective, or knowing that we don't have whatever other resources might be possible. So I think it's the balance of knowing when to drive a process, a selection system, a development program, whatever it may be, that is going to meet the needs from me, that I want to make sure I feel comfortable about this as an IO, to the business who's saying, I need this yesterday, give it to me as soon as possible. I don't care about all these other steps. And so it's translating the need from a science-based perspective into their outcomes that they care about. To say, I can give you something yesterday. You're going to use this tool to hire someone, and it's not going to help you hire someone better. If you give me time and you let me build it, here are the outcomes. Here's the benefit you are going to have now, and invest in me and give me the time and give me the resources. So I think that was the biggest balance, that you kind of just have to learn to be flexible and adapt and give the business what they need in their terms, so that they understand and you're talking their outcomes.
I agree. I think when I started, there was sort of a pros and cons to joining a team that was established in an organization that kind of respected the profession. That had benefits and drawbacks, because we were seen as kind of those sort of internal professors, you know, behind the curtain. And now I think you know, IO psychology is seen as a business asset. People know what it is. You don't have to explain it as much as you did, you know, 15 years ago. And so, so that benefit is always there. When I started, there was a lot of explaining what we did, what we didn't do. You know, I'm not a clinical psychologist that happens to be at work, right? That's not what I do. So there was a lot more of explaining that back then than there is now. There's just a lot more in front of the curtain of the business value of this profession. So thankfully, you don't have to spend as much time explaining it as you used to. That was a big kind of a barrier when I first started. I agree, though, there's a full range of kind of good, better, best, perfect. And when you're in school, you learn a lot about what perfect looks like. And it's never that way. You're always making a trade-off. Occasionally it's an ethical trade-off, and you end up making, giving advice or making decisions or pulling yourself out of something that you believe is actually just wrong versus not good. You know, it could be better, could be more scientifically sound. We could take longer, we could get you know, more results or something. So there's always that tension between trying to make it as good as it can be given the conditions you're in, versus not doing something at all. And I say that coming from someone who, from a research perspective, I wrote my dissertation on the effect of perfectionism at work. So I can say that knowing that I err towards wanting things to be perfect. And my challenge is always saying, okay, what's realistic and possible for this company, this client, this group, where they're at, where they are now.
Yeah, and I'm going to add the professor point of view and say that we teach you what is perfect so you know what you can compromise on and what you can't. Because if you don't know that, you can't make those decisions. So the next question is, what skills does the PhD training in IO psychology program help students develop? And I think I saw another question similarly for master's level. So what are the skills that you developed through the graduate program that helped you?
I can go first, I would say. So in a PhD program, we had kind of, the difference for us was a lot more deeper, harder statistics courses. So a lot of, you know, more advanced statistics courses. So that for us was a big difference. We took more, even additional broader psychology courses. We had more time to do that. So things around cognitive psychology and developmental psychology and some of those other specialty areas, but that still apply. So I think there was more of that. That just gives you a different background to know kind of the broader sense of psychology research that you can bring to an organization. I think from a real practical side of things, no matter which degree path you pursue, you are absolutely going to have to be organized, have project management skills, have to work with other people and other teams. And that is, I think I saw a question about, do you do a lot of things alone or in a group? Now more and more things are done much more collaboratively and in groups, and we see that through diversity and inclusion research too. That bringing in more minds and more perspectives can give you a greater end product. So I would say a lot of work that I do and have always done has been group. There are things I've been accountable for and responsible for that are my project at the end of the day, but rarely is something a solo endeavor. So I think working in teams, working in groups is a skill you learn no matter which degree route you pursue.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think to that last point, I saw that question as well. It's definitely teams. Even as I think in external consulting, you sometimes can be that lead consultant, that kind of decision maker. But even when you're in that role, you still have a team supporting you. You still have a team around you. And at least in my organization, I feel like in many, it's still a collaborative effort, even if it's reaching out to other internal expert teams who need to give you that advice or that technology that you're looking for, or whatever the case may be. In my experience, internal and external, it's always been collaborative. I think the master's and PhD, I agree with that. I think as you start, you're going through the cohort the same, right? And maybe this isn't the same for all programs. Ronnie, I'll let you tell me if I'm wrong there, but at least in my experience, you start with master's and PhD cohort. And so you're in the same classes, you're learning from each other. And then to Lindsay's point, that the PhD just goes a little bit deeper, a little bit broader, and more of that research focus. Go ahead, Ronnie.
It actually depends on the school. So some programs separate completely their master's from their PhD. We put you guys together, which allows the students at the master's level to interact with the PhD students, which we think is beneficial. But
yeah, when I taught it at Seattle Pacific, it was a bit of a blend. Sometimes together, sometimes separate, or sometimes in the same class, PhD students would have extra requirements above and beyond what a master's student would have. So it was kind of a both and for them.
Okay. So what kind of careers do people with a master's degree in Nio Psychology get into versus PhD?
I think it's all over the place for both. I'd say the people that were in my program that started the same year as I am, so if I take those 7 people, for example, have all ended up in different places. So one of them works in really leaned into work in continuous improvement and lean and Six Sigma and process design. And he is very much doing that as a specialty. Someone else went really into learning and development and training with her master's degree. So somebody else I know ended up, as an HR business partner and HR director. I know PhDs who ended up as HR directors or vice presidents in kind of an HR business partner, HR generalist kind of client-facing roles. So I think there are ways to be broad and get a lot of variety with either path. I think it just depends on you as a person and your nature. The doors are open, but Andre, what do you think?
Yeah, I absolutely agree in terms of like where you can go. I really do think it's up to you as an individual. I got into a lot of different spaces I wasn't intending to just because it interests me. And I said, hey, can I do this? And so I think that's what I would always recommend. I think in terms of the difference, when you're coming out with a master's versus a PhD, there is just a level of understanding that there is more education that goes in that PhD. So oftentimes you may be coming in at a little bit of a higher level than a master's. For example, some consulting firms may look for only PhD, or at least for their more seasoned roles. I personally thought that if I can get into practical work, my work quicker, and then build up my skill set, I could someday, get to where I was starting as a PhD. I feel like I was able to accomplish that. But I think there are also some organizations or maybe some specific business units or firms that just do have either a preference for PhDs that it is just going to be dependent on that company, on that firm, on that area. So in general, I completely agree. I'm a firm believer in kind of like make your career what you want and go do it. There are just, I think, some doors that maybe are open a little bit more at the start when you're a PhD. And then as you get into an organization, as you expand those skills, I think you're able to get into those doors as well, just maybe a little bit afterwards.
Great. So I'm going to combine two questions that deal with why IO psychology versus business consulting degree, or what's the difference between IO psych versus OD versus HR?
So I can answer the sort of OD versus HR. So organizational development degrees are going to focus a little bit more on team-based interventions, more around kind of an organizational diagnostic, perhaps a system intervention, or things that are very much around groups, teams, maybe some, it depends on the program or the team, around individual kind of work. It won't be as steeped in the statistics side of things, I don't think, or so that would limit your work in things like survey research, engagement research, selection, assessment, test design, things like that. That would be limiting. But you're probably going to get a little bit more around team and system theory than and much more deep into some of those sides of things than others. The HR side of a degree program is going to be broader in terms of things like compensation analysis and design, which I ended up taking as an elective in our business school as one of our kind of outside of psychology options. So that was very useful. And one of the things that I did an internship in was in compensation. So you will learn things around compensation, benefits design, working with individual leaders, perhaps things on mobility and relocation, designing systems or technology. So it's going to be hitting a lot of different parts of an HR as a function. And some of those other special, things that when you're in a bigger organization become their very own specialty, you will get a bit more of all of those different specialties than an IO program or an OD program, which is gonna be a little bit more in the talent management side of things. The business psychology one, I don't know that I can answer that difference. I haven't looked at a program comparison. I don't know if you can, Ronnie.
No, I have no idea. Typically a PhD in business, those students tend to go into business school positions, teach in business schools, unlike in IO psychology, where many of our students end up in applied roles. So one of the common misconceptions is that you get a PhD if you want to teach or do research. And the reality is that the majority of students actually don't end up in an academic position. They end up in an applied position. And we lost Andre. Hopefully he will rejoin us shortly. Let's see. Is there more room to grow in an internal consulting position rather than an external consulting position?
I don't know. I guess it depends by room to grow. If you mean kind of by levels and promotability, and that is going to really just depend on the size of the company. A lot of times in internal consulting positions, because the organization itself will change, there's opportunity to to kind of expand and grow and figure out what the gaps are that you and your skill sets can fill. So oftentimes the variety can be a little more easier to come by because you can volunteer and create those projects and kind of get into it, depending on, you know, the type of organization you're in or the leader you have. In an external organization, larger consulting firms are a little more, they tend to, you know, they have products that they're selling or a line of things that they do and a way in which they do them. And so your growth might be more of trying to get assigned to different types of work. Very large consulting firms would even have you aligned to type of client business. So you work primarily with technology companies, or you work primarily with financial services companies or manufacturing or something like that. So in a really large consulting firm, the variety and growth is going to be dependent on your ability to volunteer or get moved around to different clients and different types of work within whatever job positioning systems that they have in the really large firms. In a smaller firm, and in like the firm that I was in, we, you know, we wanted to do good work for good partners and be good, you know, and be a good consulting firm. So we had a lot more latitude to kind of decide how we wanted to grow as consultants because we were so small. And internally, I've seen the ability to grow as internal consultants sometimes can be a little easier because you have access to figure out what are the gaps and things that we can fill without you know, trying to do as much selling as you would maybe externally.
Great, thank you. So one question was about, okay, let's see, I lost it. Okay, what was your reason to work in the IO industry versus working in research?
I can start there. Working applied was always what really interests me. I think it goes back to why I got interested in IO from the start is how are people affected in organizations? For me, it really came to life with a couple of leaders that I had and seeing, again, the difference between that really strong leader and a leader who was not great, and the trickle-down effect through the entire organization was something where I could see the practical application of an intro to IO psych course to it happening in real life. And so I was always interested in how can you take what an IO psychologist is going to learn and apply that to the workplace to make it better, to make people better, to make better selection decisions, to work one-to-one with leaders in development, or to work on development in general. And so I was more interested in how I could practically apply that to people in the workplace setting, and not as much in the how do we find out some of those research ideas that then we may take later into practice. But I was more interested in that second piece, that bringing it to people piece, that I think seeing it come to life in that person was always something that really interested me, and why I wanted to go apply it early on.
Great. So there were a couple of questions about salary. There was one question about the difference in salaries between having a master's versus a PhD. And somebody asked about getting commissions. So if you want to talk a little bit about salaries and your experiences at the various organizations.
Yeah, I'll say, I mean, I finished my PhD while I was working. It didn't automatically get me any kind of increase in pay or anything like that. Being on a team of IO psychologists at the time, there was certainly that little bit of respect, a little bit of pressure, a little bit of we want you to be able to say that you did it just like us. But there wasn't any time limit. There wasn't a kind of a salary bonus or something because I finished. I was able to say that I did it and kind of feel like I sort of earned the level I was in, which was the same level as other PhDs. So for me, it was more like feeling like I'd earned the right to be at that same level by finishing. So that didn't kind of get me anything. When I've been hiring people in the roles that I'm in, you know, internally there are roles and salary bands and you know, qualifications or preferred or things like that. I often have looked for, you know, PhD with a certain number of years of experience, or masters with relevant experience, sometimes more, sometimes the same amount. So it's really dependent on the type of work that we're doing. When it is things that require things that a PhD would need more of, perhaps some advanced statistics or some of that work, that might just make the role itself worth more money. Having more experience in that degree might get you a slightly more of a starting salary, perhaps, compared to someone that has a master's. But typically, the role itself is going to be given a pay range, and then you'll be paid within that. More experience, more education. Usually both, one or the other, will get you somewhat of an edge. When I was consulting, it was a small firm or for myself, and so I can only answer for how we paid ourselves on an hourly rate based on, and we would kind of bid the projects based on how much we thought it was going to take, and then at the end, kind of, I might get commission if we turned it into something bigger, more a second project, if I was kind of able to add some other pieces to it that we might not have started out saying we wanted to do. But I, by virtue of joining my friend and her firm, kind of negotiated for myself an hourly rate because we were small and it was very project based at the time with no infrastructure. Other consulting firms are going to have a whole different pay structure. So Andre, I don't know if you can answer about commissions or things like that.
Yeah, I think you're right. It totally depends. For a bigger consulting firm like SHL, we just have a salary. We are not on the commission side. We have an entire sales team. That doesn't mean that we don't support sales from now and then. Usually, it's from like the solution designing. So if a sales rep is out there just trying to bring in that, someone may say we're interested in an assessment in general. But then we need to come in and kind of say, well, how do we scope this to turn into really what you're looking for? So there is some of that work from what we call more of a pre-sales or solution architecture perspective, but we are not commissioned against that. Sometimes there are bonuses if you drive what we call cross-sale. So you have an existing client, you're working with them, and then you're working to build them an assessment, and they say, hey, we have a leadership development initiative, and then that turns into more work with SHL. That might be a bonus, but we are not tied to any type of commission based on sales because we do have that fully dedicated sales team.
Great. So are organizations in the United States required by law to have internal or external IO psychologists? It looks like many organizations now hire IO psychologists. So what do you have to respond to that?
I would say it's not required by law, but I would say that I'll speak to some examples. So I think Targeted is actually a great example. And this is all in the press, but years ago, they did have different types of psychologists working for them, even in the selection space. What that led to was some assessment practices that were deemed to be not fair by the EEOC. And so because of settlements, it actually led to a much more focus on IO psychologists, because we bring that level of science and we bring that level of understanding of what is necessary from an EEOC perspective. And so that is one very small example, but one of the key differentiators I think that we bring is understanding some of that employment law. We are definitely not employment lawyers, but we learn about how to make sure fairness is in your assessment practices, is in your decisions. And those talent management decisions, those are where you open yourself up to potential legal risk if you're not doing them in an objective and a fair way, and you have validation evidence to tell us we are doing this for the right reasons because we are predicting these outcomes and can show that. And so that is the piece that is really important for IO Psychs to bring, and why organizations, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why organizations are realizing that you need that either internal to your organization to understand that and kind of help present yourself from risk, or work with external consultants. So I use that as a very small example, but one that is practical. And to Lindsay's point before, is like, she said, I'm not a, she had to convince people that I am not a clinical psych working in the workplace. Well, we have to convince people of that because in the past there was that. And so the evolution of it, I think, has brought it more of a focus on IO to really ensure we're bringing those strong practices.
Great. Lindsay?
Yeah, I agree. There's no law that I know of, no requirement. There are comfort levels with different organizations on their, what from their own risk they're willing to accept, and having different levels of expertise, whether it's internal or external, especially in the selection side of things. That's, I think, where it's most, probably where it's strongest. So some organizations will have that, and it's very much a part of their own kind of internal rule, not really a law, but an internal rule. Either way, I think it's very helpful to befriend your employment law teams internally, if you are internal, to know, and they tend to be very appreciative of someone who knows when to call them, how to mitigate risk, but each organization also has a different comfort level with some of that risk, and where they're willing to take risks and where they're not. Some of that depends on their own history and trust with employees, on just how many of them sue them in a year, and how widespread and how public that might be if certain things were to happen. And other organizations tolerate more of that and handle those risks differently. So from a legal perspective, I think it's always best to know and befriend whoever is working in employment law, for all kinds of reasons, privacy and security and EEOC, and just there are a lot of things that legally you might not learn in grad school, but are very applicable in the business world, that just knowing that, and them knowing that you want to be a curious and legally respecting partner internally will go a long way, whether or not you have a PhD or not.
Great. Lindsay, I'm going to start with you on this one. Is there any career paths that would involve the tech industry and the IO industry?
Say it again. I lost you in the middle. Any career paths that would involve
tech, given that you worked for Microsoft?
Yeah. So at Microsoft, both at Microsoft and at Expedia, we had internal teams of user design, user experience, a lot working with some things that are kind of classical human factors and design and research on things like hardware, the shape of a mouse, things like that. If you were to go down really into the human factor side, there's a lot on the tech space, especially in the hardware side of things. And the software side of things, also in research and design. We worked with a lot of our user experience groups and befriended them enough that they would let us use their one-way mirror, two-way mirror focus group rooms to do some of our own employee research in those research rooms. Some of them had IO backgrounds or similar in some of those tech software and hardware development roles, tended to be on the design and the research side.
Yeah, and I would say too, from our perspective, technology is always coming in. So how do you work with technology? I think one great example is, as we have more and more data, you can make data say things, or you can get in there and find the answers to questions, but how exactly did you get there? And are we really thinking about the parameters of what we're asking? And so I think that's where IO and kind of data science and some of these tech things can really collide, to make sure that if we have this black box and we have answers coming out of it, is there theory behind what we're actually finding here? Or is it just enough data tells us this? So for example, as we bring in artificial intelligence, we're developing software where you can do a video interview, And based off of your facial cues, it'll start to score that. Now, that is really cool in one sense, but the other sense is from an objective assessment perspective, what are we actually assessing? From an IO perspective, when the computer tells me that this is a good candidate because they answer the questions well or whatever is going on behind the scenes, it's our job to kind of add the theory and the practice to what that technology can do. And I think that's a fun intersection of them both to really develop and deploy new technology that can get you some really awesome answers, but does it in an objective way that from that science perspective, we feel much more comfortable with.
And I would say when I was consulting in our small firm, the person that ended up doing our kind of survey and assessment online programming and design started as an IO psychology grad student, ended up kind of ADD, never finished his dissertation because he got sidetracked by learning programming while he was doing that, and ended up being a really great developer of surveys and online assessments. So he had that understanding of why we were doing certain things with surveys or assessments, but then bringing it to life on screen. So he kind of made his own path and was kind of this interesting, he totally knew from a consultant perspective what we were trying to do, and from a design perspective he could create it or come up with something new that also wasn't anti some of the things that we were trying to do. So I think, yeah, technology is a great path.
Yeah, and I will say that there are a lot of I know a lot of people that are working at places like Amazon or Microsoft, Google. They all have people working for them in their people analytics, so understanding kind of that HR side. Who are we hiring? How are we training? Who are we promoting? But also a lot of data analytics, which IO psychology programs will prepare you for. Even at the master's level, when you're only required to take a subset of the courses, in statistics, the preparation is very, very strong. For example, that's one area of difference between like HR or OD programs to IO psychology, is that you will get that statistical background. And there are a lot of programs now that say they're data science. And when you look at them, you get exactly what you would get in the IO program, except in the IO program, in addition to the statistics, you also learn about, the content. So you're a much better data scientist because you understand the content, as Lindsay mentioned. We'll do a couple more questions and then we skip to my presentation because I worked hard on it and I want to talk about it. And then Lindsay and Andre, if you want to take a look at the questions that are in the Q&A, both the answered one and the open one, and kind of jot down some of your thoughts to that as we finish, feel free to do that. So a couple short questions. One is, does IO seem to be more popular in certain regions of the country?
I think, if you look at PsyOp, the website does a member survey and demographics and stuff every year, and you can tell by where the conference moves around. I just think by virtue of where the jobs historically have been, you do see a lot more in California, you see a lot more on the, in the East Coast. I think that says more about where those businesses are in those industries than it does the people that live there. They're living there because that's where those jobs were from some of those, historically larger companies. I don't think there is an inherent geographic bias, towards IO one way or the other.
Yeah, I saw that question earlier and was thinking about it, and I completely agree. I think it's just more, where are the bigger cities that have those larger Fortune 500 companies that are going to have not only the internal need, but also then external clients around them to support them. So I think it's more a result of that than specific geographies leading to IOs.
Great. Let's see. One last question here. Do organizations benefit financially from conducting research?
I mean, I guess I can start from, from my perspective, I think absolutely. So for SHL, it's an easy one because we are always doing research on new solutions, on new things that we essentially can sell to our customers, right? As we came into the digital age, as COVID was happening and almost everyone was working from home, we developed some new solutions to really help kind of guide development on a working from home capacity. That was done from research first to develop a solution that then we could work with our clients on. If I think of it from even like a target perspective or an internal perspective, the more you do research, to me, the more you're just trying to get information on your employees, on what's happening. And if you can take that and put it into practice of understanding what might be better, that inherently is going to lead to success in the bottom line, whether that's by keeping your employees happier through engagement surveys, because that's research on your team, right? Or you're developing new ways of working, or new ways of hiring, or new ways of doing any of those things that in the end, the goal is really just to improve efficiency or outcomes. And why are we trying to do that? To improve the financial, aspects in the bottom line. So I think absolutely, because all you're trying to do is continuously learn. Any companies that don't do research and don't evolve, we don't talk about anymore because they're not, major companies anymore.
Yeah. I'd say when I was at Starbucks, one of the major projects that we worked on was connecting, it's called at the time linkage research, but connecting the research that we had on how employees were feeling about working in their store and, in the baristas in a Starbucks store, to the amount of money that Starbucks store was able to bring in, their connectedness to the company, their kind of passion for the things that we sold, the coffee itself, would translate into higher sales. They were able to, and the more excitement they brought to the job, we were able to prove generated more money, right? They were able to talk you into adding a pastry. They were able to talk you into buying a bag of coffee grounds to take home, and that generates money. So really making those connections, and something like that was not easy to do, but it was a fairly tight connection between how an employee came to work and their mindset and their feeling about the company to the amount that they were able to, sell, or how fast they were able to serve customers, which is also more money. So yeah, I think there are definitely impacts. Sometimes it's saving money, sometimes it's making money. When I was at Microsoft, we did a lot of research on different things that we were considering doing for employees in the HR space. And some of it was the ability to save money. Some of it was the ability to spend money in smart ways, and in ways that were things employees would care about. So we went through a huge kind of, for me, this ended up as a program evaluation, but we had a kind of a suite of things that we were doing for our new campus and our on-site services, and adding things like picking up your dry cleaning, giant like meals that you could get from the cafeteria to take home for your family so you didn't have to cook when you got home. A little cheaper than takeout and ready to go. We had a towel service we had locker rooms because people would bike to work a lot in Seattle. So we had towel service, and that was something that cost money. We had free beverages, free, coffee, tea, soft drinks, etc. A lot of very in-person things. And what we were trying to evaluate was kind of, if we have this bucket of money, where's the best place to spend it? And sometimes employees would say they wanted one thing, like these to-go meals, for example, but our research and the money would show they weren't actually buying them. And so we were wasting a lot of money having this option, in the cafeteria that employees said they wanted and just weren't buying and weren't taking home. So we said, okay, where else could we spend that money? What is the actual thing that behaviorally people don't just say they want, but are actually going to use? We did an experiment where we took some of the towels out of some of the locker rooms and said, kind of bring your own towel. And the uproar that caused was humongous, because it was, to a lot of those employees, that made it so much easier to commute less, bike to work, kind of get their exercise in, and the bringing a towel, and then I have this weird sweaty towel, and what do I do with it? And just was so inconvenient and such a problem that the small amount of money and just the chatter on that, the time wasted complaining about this, was a lot of money. And so the ability to say, not worth it, put the towels back, take the giant family-sized meals out of the cafeterias, you know, and really say, here, you know, if we have this amount of money to spend on things for employees, here's where it needs to go. And you know, that was a real tangible thing that as an Nio psychologist and program evaluator, I could say, you know, here's how we should spend our money.
Thank you both. It's appreciated. Again, if you don't mind taking a few minutes to take a look at the questions that are listed as answered, if you want to add to it. Before I move on to my presentation on creativity and innovation, I just want to mention there were a number of questions about graduate programs and what is better and what major should I have and so on. And the reality is that there are huge differences between different graduate programs in what they prefer and what they're looking for. So I would strongly recommend taking a look at the different requirements, what they want, what they're looking for in their students. Some programs care if you have previous experience in HR, and others do not. Some want you to have some research experience, others do not. If you're unsure, feel free to contact the director of the program. I'm the director of our IO program. I answer lots of emails. I do a lot of Zoom calls or phone calls with interested students to clarify what our requirements are or what our preferences are. That is very acceptable. It's appropriate to ask. So reach out and find out what those requirements or preferences are. So you're applying to the right programs and you're setting yourself up for success. So I'm going to start my own presentation. When I'm done, I'm going to monitor the Q&A again and try to answer any questions with that as well. But I can't do both. I'm not that talented. I can't talk and check the Q&A at the same time. So creativity and innovation in organizations. It's not a surprise, by the way, that both Andre and Lindsay got their degree from the University of Nebraska at Omaha. When we decided to do this, I said, I know exactly who I can ask. So they're both students from our program. And I have been doing research on creativity and innovation for over 30 years at this point. I've been doing it for so long that I still remember the time when I was told that organizations don't care about creativity and innovation, and why am I studying this? Which is not the case today, thankfully. So why do we care? Creativity is really critical for today's organizations. Organizations face complex problems. There are rapid changes in technology. Consumers expect things to evolve and change, right? So like if Apple comes out with a new iPhone and it doesn't have too many new features, there's an uproar about that. It really gives organizations a competitive advantage. And again, the complexity of the problems that we're facing is a huge part of this. Even if you think about something like COVID, right? Really complicated problem that needs solving from multiple fronts. And we really needed some creativity and innovation. And frankly, looking at some of the creative ideas that came about during COVID to address some of the needs was very interesting, both in terms of the employees' needs, but also in the medical field. There have been some really interesting innovations. You could also look at the importance of creativity. The World Economic Forum identifies the top 10 skills for every other year or so. They put out a new list. The list for the top 10 skills needed in 2025. Of those top 10, 5 are directly related to creativity and innovation. It's analytical thinking and innovation, complex problem solving, critical thinking, creativity and originality, and reasoning, problem solving, and ideation. By the way, the numbers behind it tell you what number they are on the list. So of the top 5 skills, 4 are related to creativity. So if at this point, I'm hopefully convinced you that creativity is important. What I want to do is talk about myths about creativity and then sort of tell you why these are myths and are incorrect. When I do executive education, when I talk to business people, these are things that I hear about creativity that sort of make it more difficult for business to be creative. So we really need to get rid of those perceptions that are incorrect based on the science. So the first one is that we can't define creativity. Creativity is specific to specific domains like art or science. When we talk about creativity, we're really talking about having a lot of ideas. So like something like brainstorming. Or alternatively, creativity requires you to have this aha or light bulb moment. And then you're either creative or you're not. So it's not something you could teach. You are or you are not. So first of all, the definition. First, we have a definition of creativity. We've had this definition for over 40 years at this point. People that are doing research on creativity and innovation in psychology, in management, in design, they all agree that creativity is, it could be an idea, it could be a solution to a problem, it could be a product, or it could be a process that is both original or novel and useful or appropriate. So it needs to include both components. And what typically happens is that people think about creativity as kind of that originality, novelty side and forget about the usefulness. But if you think about it from a business perspective, if you have a solution that is not useful, that it is original but not useful, we can't implement it, it can't help the business. I'll give you an example. One of the ways I study creativity is by asking students to solve student-related problems. One of the problems we use is basically distilled down to there's no parking on campus, which is a common complaint in every university that I've ever been at. And one person wrote down building parking structures on the moon. Great idea, very original. Nobody else wrote it. But does it really solve the parking problem? No, it doesn't, right? At least not right now. Maybe one day we'll have the technology to build parking structures on the moon and do it effectively and cheaply, but not at the moment. Now, if we have a solution that is useful, it solves the problem, but it's not original, we have a routine solution, it's not creative. So you really need both components. So we can define creativity, and we do know what it is. It's an idea, solution, product, or process that is both original and useful. Creativity is not only limited to science or art. You could come up with creative ideas, for example, for a new dish, combining ingredients that you didn't think to combine before. You could convince a friend to do something or help you out, right? You could kind of find a creative way to do that. You could come up with a new process at work that saves time. So creativity can be in any domain. But another part of this is that we sometimes think about creativity as having to make major changes. You know, I need to be the next Picasso or Einstein and develop a theory of relativity. No, we could talk about incremental creativity, which are small changes. And if you think about it from a business perspective, a number of small changes can be more meaningful, more profitable, more effective than one major change. Creativity, the next myth is creativity is a lot of ideas. Again, some of you probably have seen or used this prompt, give me some uses for a brick. And people then generate a lot of different ideas of what we could do with a brick. And really, this is a measurement of idea generation. How many different ideas can you come up with? Just because you come up with a lot of ideas doesn't mean these are good ideas. And it's not the only aspect or process associated with creativity. When we look at how creative people think, or what thinking processes are associated with creativity, we find that people spend time defining, identifying the problem, constructing it. They need to know what the problem is, or they need to see a problem that other people do not see and try to solve it. But there's also this portion of, we have a lot of ideas, now what? A common complaint I hear about brainstorming sessions is that you brainstorm, you come up with 100 ideas, and then you're done. And what do we do with these 100 ideas? Some of them are good, some of them are not. So this process of evaluating those ideas and choosing which ideas you're actually going to implement, and choosing creative ideas to implement, is really, really important. So we're seeing a lot more research work associated both with what happens before idea generation and how people define problems, and what happens after. So how do you evaluate ideas, and how do you make sure that people choose the creative ideas, because they tend not to want to. They tend to choose safe ideas, and creative ideas are risky ideas. Creativity is this aha moment. It's a common misconception. Sometimes you feel like you have this light bulb moment, but then when you reflect on it, you realize that you've done a lot of preparatory work to get to this light bulb moment. You have to be ready for that. So what we're finding is that creativity is actually very effortful and very time consuming. And you see this in businesses that allow the time for their developers, for example, their R&D and so forth, to be creative, are more creative organizations. They come up with more creative ideas, and they develop them, and they take them to market. A lot of organizations that want to have creativity will implement some sort of rule where you're allowed to take the time to be creative. You can spend up to 20% or 15% of your weekly time working on these side projects that are not necessarily part of your portfolio. Google's done it, 3M has done it, Gore-Tex has done it. So we need to recognize that creativity is effortful. And this aha moment comes about because you've been thinking about this problem for a while. It feels like an aha moment, but when you look at what happens, there has been effort behind it. In 1996, Teresa published the Componential model of creativity. It's a very influential model of creativity. It talks about the creative person, and she states that there are 3 aspects that we need to think about: the expertise, the creative thinking skills, and the motivation. The people have to be motivated to be creative. They have to have some degree of expertise or knowledge, and they have to be able to think creatively. And then they operate in an environment that either can facilitate or inhibit creativity. So when we look at it from an organizational perspective, we can facilitate creativity by creating the right conditions, or having that environment that actually facilitates creativity, as well as choosing the right individuals for the job where we need creativity. And then relating to this last myth of creativity, you're either born with it or you're not. We actually have a lot of evidence that suggests that creativity can be trained and developed. So you can do some creativity training to facilitate creativity. So in terms of the right conditions, the culture of the organization as one that is interested in creativity is important, matters. Psychological safety is one of my favorite constructs at the moment, approaches. Basically, psychological safety means that you feel safe to be vulnerable and yourself, because you're not afraid of any reprisals or being in an uncomfortable position. That means you're more willing to speak up. You're more willing to say, I have an idea, even if it's a risky idea, because you're not going to assume that people are going to, ostracize you or laugh at you. And that shows support for creativity. The other side of it is that acceptance of mistakes or failure. And basically, it's actually to the point where some organizations will not use the word mistake or failure. This is a learning opportunity. If we tried something and it didn't work, what did we learn? We had a learning opportunity. Now let's move on. As opposed to organizations where if you tried something new and it didn't succeed, you're fired, right? So if you're fired, you're not going to, and you see somebody else getting fired for a failure, you're not going to try a new idea again. But if you see the organization being tolerant of these mistakes or failures and learning from them, you're going to feel very comfortable presenting some new ideas and trying out some new things that could be very successful. And then also accepting diversity in general and diversity of ideas in particular leads to improvement in creativity. In terms of selection or who the creative individuals are, as I mentioned, expertise is really important. You can't, if you don't know the field, you're just going to reinvent the wheel. You're not going to come up with a creative solution. You have to have those creativity skills in terms of the thinking processes. Creative individuals tend to be open to experience. They're willing to try new things. But they're also very, very persistent. My favorite story is about Stephen King, the author, who submitted his first book, I think close to 40 times before a publishing company was willing to publish it. And I don't know about you guys, but if somebody told me that if I wrote something and it wasn't good and it got rejected not once and not twice, maybe after 3 or 4 times I would give up. He didn't. They're also very independent and they're extremely motivated by the work that they're doing. They enjoy being creative. They like to work on creative things. So you need to give them that space to do that. And finally, with regards to training, we find that creativity training is very effective. It promotes ideation. It promotes creative problem solving in general. And the other thing that's interesting, it promotes attitudes toward creativity and perceptions of oneself as being more creative. So you're more willing to try, you're more motivated. So it's not just that we're influencing the creative problem solving, we're influencing the perception of the person of who they are and their motivation to be creative. So this was really designed to be a quick summary of what we know in a field that I find absolutely fascinating. If you want to contact me directly, my email is here, my Twitter is here. I'll leave it up for a second before I'll stop the share. If there are any questions, okay, so there's a comment. Great to learn that creativity can be learned. Absolutely. And there's some great programs out there. There's some bad ones too, so just be careful. But there's some really good programs out there that will teach creative processes and teach them in the right way. So, any other thoughts or questions, or whether to me or to Lindsay or Andre?
We've been getting through the Q&A.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah. So it sounds like I'm describing the process of a theatrical production. There's a lot of commonality between what is happening in business and in art. I think one of the differences is that we don't usually talk about usefulness in art, right? Painting doesn't need to be useful, but the painter had some sort of message that they wanted to convey. And if the audience doesn't get that message, or if the audience is not moved by the painting, then, you know, so it's a different sort of a thinking about it, but it's still, you have that component of novelty, but also, you know, it could be the technical execution, or it could be whether, you know, you're moved by the artistic production. Absolutely. Anything else, guys? Okay, so if we are done and our audience is dropping, since it's getting late, at least if you're on the East Coast and Central Time, I appreciate you taking the time. This will be on YouTube. If for some reason you came in late, or you know of people that are interested, we will send you the link to the YouTube video for this. And you could also see the previous one that we've done, and we'll do another one in a few months with different topics, both in terms of the research side as well as the you know, practical side of getting into graduate school and what is IO psychology all about. No, it is not PsyOp YouTube. This is, although I would recommend going onto the PsyOp YouTube. It is, Dr. Sarah Perry has her YouTube channel, and she will send it out to everybody once she's done editing the video and putting it on. So we'll send it to everybody that signed up. Okay. Thank you very, very much, everyone. Thank you for hanging in there, Lindsay and Andre. It's appreciated.
Yeah, thanks, Ronnie, for having us.
Yeah,
Bye,
thanks.
guys.